All right. Fourth string podcaster, as Ben would do, hold up the number 4. He likes to do that when we start in podcast. It's just me rocking it solo today. I'm testing out some new things. This is kind of what we do in the off season. When there is no college football, we like to test out some different things, kind of like to reformat the shows. We get prepared for next season. So that's kind of what I'm doing today. You're going to get an actual podcast, but we're going to do just some different things just to kind of test it out, see how it works. So you will not see Ben today. You will be blessed with my presence, though. And for that, you are welcome. Yeah, and there's been a lot of just cool college football stuff happening over the past few weeks. I, by the way, am a disaster. We're about ready to leave for Florida on vacation for a little bit, which I'm excited about. And I've been sick like the past 3 days, so I sound terrible. However, I've decided, you know what? No matter how I sound, we're going to do a podcast anyways. And, there's a lot of just cool stuff happening during this off season. I feel like it's been very active. But one of the things that I was seeing came out, it came out earlier in the week, last week rather. So college football, and let's see if I can do this appropriately. We're trying on some new things today. But so high-ranking football leaders, this is a story from Sports Illustrated. High-ranking football leaders have been reviewing 4 specific changes to clock rules, 2 of which are considered non-controversial, one that has garnered wide support, and a 4th that's left some divided. So let's talk about what these are. So non-controversial proposals include 1, prohibiting consecutive timeouts. So basically no icing the kickers. And then secondly, no longer extending a first or third quarter for an untimed down if the quarter ends on a defensive penalty. Yeah, that one seems to be unanimous. I don't think it would happen all that often, but whatever. Let's talk about the other 2 proposals, which are a little bit more significant. Yeah, we've got something here with Jason Siegel and Harrison Ford popping up. You cannot read a Sports Illustrated article with at least 30 advertisements thrown in. I mean, look at this, crazy. All right, I digress. Let's move on. Third proposal, garnering wide support. The clock will continue to run after an offense gains a first down, except inside of 2 minutes and a half. And another proposal, the clock will continue to run after an incomplete pass once the ball is spotted for play. So that third proposal is pretty significant because that's one of the, I think, unique things when you watch a NFL game and you watch a college football game that's very different. In college football, you get a first down, the clock stops. This is basically saying it's only going to do that when you're inside of 2 minutes and a half. So we're basically going to get some sort of some form of 2-minute warning. And then the other one, the clock is going to continue to run after an incomplete pass once the ball is spotted for play, which means the clock's just going to keep running. I think the goal here is they want to shorten the time of some of these college football games. I think they also want to reduce the number of plays. They're doing this all in the name of fewer player injuries. That's what they're doing this. That's what they're doing this for. Will it have that effect? That I don't know. Here's the thing about these player injuries. I think the way they're looking at it is the fewer the plays, the fewer the chances players have to get injured. So if we can keep the clock moving, we're going to reduce the number of plays, right? Here's what I think is actually contributing to the increase that we're seeing in injuries. I think it's the frequency, the time between one play to the next, the actual real time, not the time ticking off the clock in the game, but the actual real time. When you look at these hurry up offenses, Alabama gets a first down and boom, they're going to the line, getting to the line. There is no huddling anymore. So if you're an offensive guard and you're having to run upfield, like you work the play, you run upfield, you get set for the play, you don't even have time to take a breath, and boom, we're going into the next play. And you do that, normal drive is 10, 12 plays or so, a normal scoring drive. So you keep doing that, you're going to have guys that are gassed. And yeah, you can excuse me, you can rotate as much as you want, but that's only going to help you to a certain effect. And I don't think it's that significant. So these changes, I don't think they're actually going to change the amount of injuries unless we get something that says you have to wait X amount of time before the next play can get caught. And that to me seems to be a little bit out of the spirit of football. I think these changes are really interesting. The one I'm kind of not in favor of would be the clock continuing to run after a first down. I think that is part of what makes college football so unique is you get that first down and the clock stops until the ball gets set because you just get these higher scoring games. The one thing that I do think this would impact, and this would be pretty cool, is I don't think you're going to get these 55 to 48 games anymore, because you're just not going to be able to get that many plays. And the hurry up offense isn't going to increase really the amount of opportunities that you have to score. It's just going to wear the other team down. At least that's going to be its purpose. I think it's really interesting. Here's the thing, though, about college football. If you really want to add more parity into the sport, limiting the number of plays, reducing the length of a game, that's not going to create parity. If you really want to do it, there is one thing that college football does not have that I think it so desperately needs, and that is roster limits. Okay, it does have roster limits, but here's the roster limit in college football. 125 players can be on the roster. 85 of those can be scholarship players. So a lot of people think, okay, the limit's 85, but it's not. That's how many scholarship players you can have on a team. The actual roster limit in college football is 125. Is it just me, or does that seem like it's astronomically large for it to be that? And what we already know, there's been a history of this in college sports. Like, part of why John Wooden at UCLA was such a great coach is, okay, yes, he was this great coach. He was this basketball mastermind. He was this great leader, all of those things. But it's also because when he was coaching, there were no roster limits in basketball. So literally, he's at UCLA. A kid wants to go play for Cal. He can go to that kid that's wanting to go play for Cal and say, no, I want you to come here. And he's got zero intention of actually starting that kid or that kid having a significant impact to his team. He just doesn't want to play against them. He just doesn't want them to go to Cal. We see this happen in college football. And that's why the transfer portal has just exploded. This 3-star gets an offer from Georgia because he thinks Georgia is uniquely interested in him. Georgia's not. Georgia's they just don't want, Kirby Smart just doesn't want the kid to go to South Carolina and all of a sudden they got to play him. He just doesn't want to see this kid go to Missouri and all of a sudden they got to play against him. So he goes to Georgia. He doesn't play a lick, and then he transfers to South Alabama. That's what's happening right now in college football recruiting. It's the game behind the game is, who can you recruit to keep off of your peers' roster, and then they're going to transfer and you don't have to worry about ever playing against them. That's a lot of what we're seeing right now. I think college football has got to put an end to that. Really, you don't need, as long as we only have 12 games, you don't need 85 scholarship players. You definitely don't need a roster limit of 125 players. This roster limit needs to come down to, I think, about 65 to 70 players on a given roster. What you're going to see happen. So if you take, what you would have happen is, you're not going to be able to sign 25 players in a class. You're really not. You're really going to be able to get away with about 15 to 18 in a year. And so what that means for a team like Georgia is, okay, you can get 2 or 3 5-stars, you can get 5 or 6 4-stars, you get several 3-stars, but you can't just keep bringing more people on. And so now some of these leftover 3 and 4-star athletes are like, well, I can't go to Georgia because Georgia's class is already completely full. They literally do not have room. So now this player that might have otherwise gone to Georgia, now that player is going to go to South Carolina. Now that player is going to go to Missouri. That would create parity. The more you can spread talent around to these other conferences, that creates parity. Like, ultimately, I know I love to bring in these really smart coaches. And like, coaching in college football and college basketball, like, it matters. It's really important. But a coach with all the right players is only going to be so good. Like, ask yourself this: Shane Beamer at South Carolina. Do you ever see South Carolina being substantially better than they were this year? I think they hit their limit. I think South Carolina literally hit their limit this year with Shane Beamer. But if scholarship or if roster limits were reduced to about half of where they're at, well, what it would do is it would allow Shane Beamer in South Carolina to bring in a couple of 4-stars. Maybe they still a 5-star or 2. Now, all of a sudden, South Carolina can be a really, really good program. That's the thing that would fix college football. You can have, I don't care how many ever teams in this playoff that you want to have. We can talk about that. You can have NIL. You can have all of that stuff. But if you have 125 players on a roster, you're going to end up with 2 or 3 teams every year being substantially better than what we've had before. And I'm sorry, we had great semifinal games. They were fun. But you cannot have a college football national championship be 65-7. That's not okay. That's not the spirit of the sport. And the way to fix that would be to spread talent around by reducing scholarship limits. That is the way you can fix all of these issues right now that you have in college football. That's the secret recipe. I don't believe in, for a minute, I don't believe in just reducing the number of plays. That's not necessarily going to fix it. It might make some games more fun. It might reduce the number of injuries. But if you really want to fix college football, you got to figure out a way for 4 and 5 star kids to not all go to Georgia, not all go to Ohio State, not all go to USC. Reducing scholarship limits, that's the key to doing that. Okay, so another story. So that worked well, right? We were able to get that story on there. So let's see if I can get another story on here, get it on the screen. I don't know if I'll be able to do it. All right, let's try it. Did I do it? How's it? Oh, boom. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? I love this. Okay. So let's bring this on. So Florida ACC revenue has to change. And this is fascinating to me. So the Florida State Athletic Director, Michael Alford, told his board of trustees on Friday, something has to change when it comes to closing the growing revenue gap with other conferences, a sign that one of the biggest brands in the ACC is unhappy with the current structure. It goes on to say, if you read through this article, the ACC is going to fall behind the SEC and Big Ten in revenue by about $30 million per year when their respective new television deals kick in. It should also be noted that Florida State is locked into this, or the ACC is locked into its television deal with ESPN through 2036. And it's, if we scroll down, the league has all schools tied together with agreement of rights that last the length of the contract as well. The interesting thing about the ACC, and this is why this is really important. So you can see the differences here. ACC distributed $578 million. The SEC distributed $721 million. So these are very different. But scroll down here. This is the important part. ACC media rights deal makes it so that every school only gets 7% of the distributions of the conference. So Florida State contributes roughly double that to the ACC. And they're only getting half that. That's not great, especially when they're looking at their peers, Oklahoma, Texas, USC, UCLA, going into these better media rights deals. So I'm with the Florida State AD here. You got to change this. In NIL, where you have, players, I mean, Caleb Williams, how much is he getting at USC? Is it, I guess he's probably making upwards of a couple million a year, I would guess. I think we're going to see more of that. We're going to see that continue to increase. Okay, well, as more money is needed to bring in these players for NIL, I think what that also means is you've got to bring in more revenue as a program from your conference. So the ACC, I mean, think about it. If you've been to a Florida State game, it's packed with 70,000 plus, right? Have you been to a Duke game? Duke can bring in a big name team. Their stadium seats 40,000, and on a good day, they'll get 30,000. You watch some of those Duke games, and I'm a Duke fan. They literally will have maybe 10,000 people in the stands. And I mean, you better hope that they don't get like a Thursday night game, because if they get a Thursday night game, nobody's going to show up unless it's against UNC. Like literally the only time Duke fills their stadium is when UNC comes to play. So is it really fair that Duke and Syracuse and Boston College and Wake Forest are getting the same amount of revenue from the conference that Florida State is getting and Clemson is getting? Not at all. Like, it's ridiculous that that's the case. And so when you got a big school that's looking around going, we're already struggling to compete with this NIL stuff. Now we've got our conference that's not being proactive, that's not paying us our fair share right? They're spreading this around equally when it's clear we contribute more to this conference than anybody else does. I mean, even Clemson at their peak, I don't think is as valuable to the ACC as Florida State is. Florida State is the one program in the ACC that feels like a SEC rival, that feels like they've got the passion, the board, the boosters to really compete at a really top tier level. Clemson feels like they're a really well coached team that's got some nice resources, and it's a good program, that's for sure. And SEC would love to have Clemson, but Clemson as a program is much closer to an Auburn or a I don't know, maybe a Texas A&M than they are in Alabama or in LSU. And Florida State is much closer to that Alabama LSU line than Clemson is. And so Florida State's like, we're the biggest contributor to the ACC. Nobody goes to Miami games anymore. Clemson, even when they're great, doesn't contribute nearly as much as we do. Why are we only getting 7% of the revenue? Like, I totally get it. I hope the ACC figures it out, because we're having this thing like my voice is going quick. Because if the ACC cannot figure this out, Florida State's going to bolt. And if Florida State bolts, there is absolutely no reason for Clemson or Miami or North Carolina to hang out in that conference. There's no reason. They bring way too much value to the conference. Again, I'm a Duke fan. North Carolina brings a ton of value to the conference, and would be very addicted to the SEC. And the SEC, I think right now, if it wasn't for this grant of rights package that the ACC has these programs locked into, I think these programs would already be in the SEC. So what the ACC really has is about 10 years. Because if they don't have this figured out in 10 years, Florida State's just going to say, well, look, we're going as soon as the grant of rights is over. Same with the rest of these programs. The ACC's really got about 10 years to figure out how to keep these programs. And figuring out the grant of rights deal is going to be the key to that path forward. Now, it's interesting. If the ACC opens up the book on that grant of rights deal and redoes the revenue, does it open up the timeline on that grant of rights deal? And because you're already in negotiations for that, could Florida State renegotiate the grant of rights in the termination of that contract? Because if they could, the story behind the story here, and I don't know this for a fact, I'm not enough with contracts to really understand all the ins and outs. It just feels like something that I think Florida State could be trying to do. They could be trying to force the ACC into a negotiation table to redo the termination date of that grant of rights package so that Florida State can exit the ACC. Like, Florida State might already be like, mentally, we're done. We're done with the ACC. Like, we're trying to get out. And that's what this could be, is let's create a smoke screen. Let's pretend like we're still going to work with the ACC. But as soon as they open this thing up for contracts and negotiations, we're going to figure out a way out. That could be the angle that Florida State is approaching this with. And I hope not, because if that happens, you're going to have a lot of these programs, like Duke will be one of them, Boston College. I think Virginia Tech's going to be in a really tough spot, UVA, where do you go? What do you do with these programs? And I don't know the answer. I still think Duke and Kansas and Arizona should work together to form some sort of big basketball conference. I don't know how they would do it, but I think to figure it out, because the writing is on the wall, I think, with Florida State and the future of the ACC. And if you look at the way this has been going, we're going to end up with a with two major conferences. That is what we're going towards, is two super conferences. I think Florida State, the additional piece about this is has ESPN been tampering with this? Because ESPN, I mean, this has kind of been like the way it's been looked at, is ESPN's got the SEC and Fox has the Big Ten. And so and Fox also has the Big 12. And so when ESPN, or when SEC went and got Oklahoma and Texas, the way it was viewed is ESPN's taking two big programs away from Fox. And this is why Fox went and got USC and UCLA, because that was viewed as they're taking two big programs away from ESPN. And so I think the way ESPN could be influencing that is kind of teaching Florida State, here's what we want you to do. There's just so much money involved. I know that sounds like massive conspiracy stuff. It is. It is massive conspiracy stuff. But I think it's actually happening because there's just way too much money involved with this. And ESPN's a big brand and Fox is a big brand. And they both have big media rights deals with these conferences. They've got to figure out a way. Like the ACC is the last the last ground of programs available, big name programs available to either of these two conferences. And ESPN, I think, because they have the ACC bill, is figuring out a way to keep Florida State out of the Big Ten. And does it seem crazy that Florida State would entertain the Big Ten at some point? It does. But at the same time, look at all that has shifted in college football. If you had told me a couple years ago, we're going to have two programs from the state of California going to the Big Ten, where we don't even have a team west of, who's the westernmost team? Is it Minnesota or Nebraska, maybe? One of those two? I would have said you're crazy. Yet, where are we, right? And so I think there is a lot of legs with this thing. And there was another tweet I saw yesterday, too, that said, if the door was open for Florida State to go into the SEC, they'd walk right in. I don't know necessarily what that means, but I think the fact that that came out the day after this story with the Florida State AD comes out speaks a lot. All right. That's our Fourth String Podcast. Y'all have a great day.